How you doing? You probably know about IDidAThing, the highly popular Australian technology channel run by Alex Apollinov, a man who definitely would be a serial killer in another life. What you might not know is that this was not his start on YouTube. Alex's big break was from this video that he made with his mate Alexa Volovich, where they go to North Korea to debunk a popular myth about state-enforced haircuts. Alex then went on to start the IDidAThing channel, while Alexa continued posting on the channel that hosted the North Korea video, BoyBoy. Now, a lot of people really like this channel. I don't, but I see why people do. Alexa is hilarious, and has this great knack for using gags and challenges as a launch point for serious political messages, while never sounding preachy. The only problem is he's a pathological liar. His video about the Pine Gap surveillance base is also contingent on the idea that Pine Gap is on Australian soil, but solely owned and operated by the United States.
It seemed like the perimeter was staffed by Aussies doing security who had no idea what the Americans were doing inside the base. So while it's run entirely by the CIA, apparently Australians are meant to have some kind of like symbolic role in it as well.
Are there any Australian staff working at Pine Gap?
Cleaners, catering. I don't think they're in charge.
This can be disproven by a video that he references.
Now, some Australians, if you're not in the intelligence community, you might actually think, well, Pine Gap is led by the United States only. That's actually not true. Pine Gap is a jointly led ground site. It means that we have a chief there who's an American and a deputy chief who's an Australian. Now, even though they have different titles, they are on the same executive level.
There's also plenty wrong with his video on David McBride.
Right, it was the other kind of trial where the judge turns to you and says, sorry mate, the Americans said the evidence you're using for your defense isn't actually allowed for national security reasons. So we've decided you have to defend yourself with zero evidence.
The evidence his team requested but was denied were 2 expert witnesses, and then only 8 documents out of an otherwise huge brief of evidence. You can read the statement of facts on his court judgment. There was plenty of evidence he could use. I could really go on, and maybe someday I'll cover these in more detail, but what disturbs me the most is just how insidious his business model is. Apolitical IDidAThing viewers move over to his channel, and drawn in by his, admittedly, very entertaining content, will believe these lies. And the result is him becoming very popular, while receiving very little pushback for the propaganda he produces. But that all changes today, where I will be breaking down his worst video, Ukraine, the Avoidable War. 18 minutes 30 of constant lies and half-truths, all with the purpose of diverting blame from the country that is actually at fault to the country trying to defend innocent people. And I don't think this is some major misstep. I genuinely believe he is trying to spread Russian propaganda intentionally. And that is an extraordinary claim that I will support with extraordinary evidence. You can check my sources up here and in the description. And yeah, this video is more than 2 years old. God, this is taking me so long to make. But at a time when support for Ukraine's resistance is more important than ever, it is vital that we get the facts straight on this war. Now, I really want to change people's minds about this guy, so I am addressing this to the average BoyBoy viewer. There's a lot to go through, but I won't assume much prior knowledge, and I'll explain everything as I go. Oh, and if you're one of the 15,000 people subscribed because you want to see another Darman Vineboom video, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to make another one of those, and you are probably not going to like this video. But I did put a lot of effort into it, and I would love if you'd watch it anyway. Alright, that's enough fluff, let's get into this. So the video starts with a brief introduction to the war, followed by a short clip of Joe Biden from the 90s arguing that Biden saw this war coming.
But 25 years ago, this same guy predicted this is exactly what would happen if the US expanded NATO into Eastern Europe.
And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped.
So, I tracked down this clip and found it came from an old interview he did about NATO expansion. And, contrary to what Alexa implies, he is actually arguing in favour of NATO expansion. What is most telling is the sentence that Alexa cut from.
And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
Strange he would leave that out. Now, some of you might already know what I'm talking about, and many of you are probably very confused. And that's okay, we're jumping ahead a bit, so let's put a pin in this and we'll come back later. He then moves on to a history of the fall of the Soviet Union, and to start, he's not doing too badly.
Now, if you want to make lots of money in the Soviet Union, the first thing you need is a really, really drunk dude called Boris. He'll do whatever you say, but the problem is, No one likes him. Boris's friends in the White House slipped him a sneaky $2.5 billion donation, allowing him to monopolize every media outlet and bribe anyone who needed to be bribed.
This is more or less true. However, he then claims this.
You can do pretty much anything now that Boris is in power. Like, even when 77% of the country votes to keep the USSR together, Boris can ignore that and go get drunk with just 3 dudes. And all he has to do is just open this document.
Firstly, it's weird that he implies that the Americans got Boris to do this, considering American intervention only started after the fall of the USSR. And secondly, this claim is just complete BS. And to explain why, we're going to need our own little history lesson. I'm sure you know about the USSR. It was a huge socialist empire known for vodka, jacked athletes, and horrific atrocities that consisted of dozens of constituent republics, including modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Then, after decades of Central Party control, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev came along and decided things should change. During his time as General Secretary, he passed the Glasnost and Perestroika reforms, which brought the USSR freedom of expression, free markets, multi-party elections, and an end to the Communist Party's political monopoly. However, my boy Gorbachev sort of shot himself in the foot. While he wanted to see big changes, he, as its leader, did not want the Soviet Union to fall apart. However, by giving political power to the republics, he gave them the freedom to rebel against the empire that had subjugated them for so many years, leading to mass upheaval across the country. So, to solve this, he drafted a new constitution for the USSR, which would convert the country to the Union of Sovereign States, where the republics have far more power and far less communism. And this is where that referendum comes in. It was not a poll just generally asking people if they wanted to preserve the USSR, but instead was specifically to gauge support for his agenda. Not to mention the fact that some republics, like the Baltics, boycotted the election, holding independence referendums instead. But this of course begs the question, if people wanted the USSR to stay together under a different form, why did it collapse? Well, on August 18, 1991, Soviet hardliners, fearing Gorbachev's reforms would lead to the collapse of the country, arrested him in Crimea, demanding he declare a state of emergency. Now luckily, the coups were apprehended and their attempt to seize power was unsuccessful. However, the rest of the country was not so lucky. Everyone had pretty much lost faith in the Union's ability to govern, and, by December, every republic had declared independence. It was then when Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, went behind Gorbachev's back and declared the USSR non-existent. So to answer your question, no. At no point did the USSR fall apart undemocratically, or did Boris dissolve the Soviet Union himself. Alright, let's continue. So in this part, he talks about the privatization of Russia's assets after it became independent. And to Alexa's credit, this is pretty much true. Shock therapy, as it was called, was pretty horrific and led to the creation of the modern Russian oligarchy. However, he said some things in this section that are a little sus.
Take 26-year-old Boris Jordan, for example, an American who worked for the bank Credit Suisse. This kid ended up owning 10% of the shares in Russia's newly privatized companies.
Alexa is vaguely correct about this. Boris Jordan bought, at most, 10% of the vouchers distributed that could be exchanged for stock. However, this program was only for half of the stock in each privatized company. So actually, he owned between 2.5% to 5% of the country's stock. However, this program didn't end up privatizing the entire economy. 30% of the largest and most profitable companies were left to be privatized later, so his share is going to be even lower than that. I think the reason he brought Boris up is because this is the closest he can get to claiming that Americans are part of the Russian oligarchy.
Well, it turns out this kid was shopping at Crazy Boris's bargain basement. Now, only 10 very special people were allowed to shop here. Just 10 of Boris's American and Russian friends were now the sole owners of the entire Russian economy.
I have absolutely no idea what he's talking about here. There is no evidence that the entire Russian economy was controlled by 10 people. Firstly, there were more than 10 oligarchs, and secondly, people other than oligarchs had stake in the economy. What's more interesting is his claim that they were Boris's American and Russian friends. While there's no particular group of 10 oligarchs, there was a group of 7 of the most important oligarchs under his rule. And guess what? Every single one of them was Russian. As far as I can tell, Boris Jordan is the closest the country had to an American oligarch, although he might not even be one, depending on how broadly you define the term. So I thought that maybe Alexa had some answers to these inaccuracies in his sources. To his credit, he does have sources. However, his method of source citing is interesting. Some like APA, others prefer the IEEE format, but BoyBoy prefers listing only certain sources and only sourcing claims when someone calls him out, because properly justifying the claims you make is for nerds. I think what he's doing here is padding the list by adding multiple sources for the few things that are true, then leaves out a source for things he knows aren't. He has 3 sources on American meddling in the 96 election, which, fair enough, is true. 1 source on the 91 Soviet coup, which he doesn't talk about in the video, and then 1 on the constitutional crisis, then 1 on shock therapy. Nothing on Boris Jordan, these mysterious 10 oligarchs, or anything to do with the dissolution of the USSR.
Life expectancy dropped by 10 years, which has never happened to a country in peacetime.
This is also not true. Between 1991 and 94, life expectancy only dropped 4 years, and on that, it's important to note that while this could have been handled much better, standard of living did eventually improve and surpass that of the USSR. Don't let him lead you to believe that the fall of the USSR was bad overall. So he finishes this part talking about how the unpopularity of Boris led to the rise of the main character today, Vladimir Putin.
Compared to the horrors of the 90s, Putin gave Russians a normal life. Well, normal by Russian standards.
Now, I'll admit I could be wrong on this one, but there just doesn't seem to be any evidence that Putin improved the lives of his citizens. The Russian economy was recovering around the same time that other post-Soviet countries were, so really it was probably just a coincidence. So he ends this section with this.
But at the end of the day, if it wasn't for the US, a dickhead like Putin would have never needed to exist.
And to be honest, ignoring the blatant misinformation, if the video ended here, it wouldn't be good, but it also wouldn't be the worst. His conclusion, that the US interfered in Russian politics, which is at least partially responsible for a disastrous 90s, then the rise of Putin, is pretty much spot on. But oh boy, we have 12 minutes to go and it only gets worse from here.
Now, once upon a time, there was like a safety buffer between the two powers, with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact on the other.
Now, despite being pretty important for the entire video, he never actually explains what this organisation is.
So what the hell's NATO? What does this all mean?
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or
Organisation du Traité de l'Atlantique Nord,
if you like baguettes, is a defensive military alliance that was established in 1949 to deter Soviet military aggression in Europe. The most important part of the treaty is Article 5, which stipulates that an attack against one NATO member shall be considered an attack against all. This means that if the Soviet Union, or now Russia, the second largest nuclear power, were to attack any NATO country, they would also have to fight the United States, the largest nuclear power. This is why being in NATO, especially those bordering Russia, is so important. Putin can't touch them because otherwise, the end of the world.
The Soviets were assured that NATO wouldn't expand further east, but they did it anyway because Russia's completely backwards, and what are they going to do about it, right?
Alexa's core argument in this section of the video is that Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansion after the collapse of the USSR. This is actually a pretty common argument that Russia now uses as an official propaganda line, an argument that I will now do my best to thoroughly debunk.
Now, when the Warsaw Pact disbanded and Germany joined NATO, the Soviets were assured that NATO wouldn't expand further east.
This promise was made in 1989 and 1990, while the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets' equivalent of NATO, still existed. It was an assurance that the US would not interfere with the USSR's security interests, and has nothing to do with modern-day Russia.
But, they did it anyway because Russia's completely backwards, and what are they going to do about it, right? But everyone from prominent foreign policy experts to senators, military officers and diplomats, they all argued that expanding NATO was a tragic error of historic proportions and that it would start a war in Europe.
Now, I want to make it clear that in the 1990s, when this was a contentious issue, there was a lot of legitimate reason to be against NATO expansion, and the letter that he cites goes through some of these. They were concerned about damaging relations with Russia by allowing other countries to join but not them.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
As well as ruining relations with countries that were not allowed in the alliance, and making it harder for the US to fulfill its obligations to its members. Nowhere in this letter does it bring up concerns about Russia invading its neighbour. There is also a line at the bottom that I think is very interesting. Russia does not now pose a threat to its western neighbours, and the nations of Central and Eastern Europe are not in danger. I wonder if any of that changed. He also cites George Kennan holding the same position.
Even the guy who designed America's whole Cold War strategy, they all argued that expanding NATO was a tragic error of historic proportions and that it would start a war in Europe.
He never said it would start a war in Europe. It's literally in the quote. He said Cold War, not an actual war. You can read this op-ed by him on the topic. Once again, no mention of Russia starting a war, only concerns about how it will affect Russian opinion of the West, and even talking about how completely unnecessary it is because we are worrying about some fanciful, totally unforeseeable, and most improbable war. So this brings us back to that clip of Biden.
But 25 years ago, this same guy predicted this is exactly what would happen if the US expanded NATO into Eastern Europe.
And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction in Russia, it would be that. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
Alexa cut out the context where Biden clarified that he wasn't talking about a military reaction, in an attempt to try to claim that Biden used to think that expansion would cause Russia to go to war. Stuff like this makes me think that he isn't just willfully ignorant, but actively trying to spread disinformation to fit his narrative. And this stuff just doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Let's imagine a hypothetical reality where Russia has imperial ambitions and NATO never expanded. Well, Putin would invade Ukraine because there's nothing stopping him. Now, instead imagine that Putin doesn't have imperial ambitions, but NATO expands anyway. Well, since Putin doesn't want to invade Ukraine, and NATO won't touch him if he doesn't touch them, Putin won't invade Ukraine. And you might be saying, well, NATO isn't just defensive, as we'll talk about later, they've done military campaigns against countries that didn't strike them first. And you'd be right. However, remember that in the same way that Russia can't attack NATO, NATO can't attack Russia, because, you know, World War III. But you might also be thinking, if NATO isn't trying to agitate Russia, why don't they just let them join? Well, Alexa brings this up actually.
Watching all this, Putin obviously realized that there are no rules. It was the law of the jungle, baby. And so, like any great jungle standoff, Putin cried and surrendered and tried to join NATO immediately. I mean, they didn't let him join.
This is another lie. Not only that, the article that this headline comes from contradicts him. Putin would have been allowed to join if he applied and went through the standard process. But he threw a temper tantrum and wanted to join before other countries who waited their turn. Speaking of this, Putin even said he wanted to join publicly and didn't view NATO as a threat.
Поэтому с трудом представляю себе и НАТО в качестве врага.
В конце концов, Россия, как вы думаете, Россия, наверное, могла бы вступить в НАТО?
Почему нет? Почему нет? Значит, я не исключаю такой возможности.
Both him and Bill Clinton confirmed that they, along with Boris Yeltsin, discussed the possibility of Russia joining it multiple times, with Bill making it clear that the door would always be open to them. And let's also not forget that these countries have a right to self-determination. They joined because they asked to join. And let's also not pretend like there was no reason to fear Russia at the time. They'd spent the 90s fucking with other countries' sovereignty, including waging one actual war. I don't want to labour the point, but this NATO expansion argument is pretty important to hammer home. So last of all, he has some sources, one of which is this leaked document where Russia talks about their position on Georgia and Ukraine's NATO membership. For some context, this is from February 2008, just before those two were unofficially promised membership in April, and Russia invaded Georgia in August. Now, none of it is really that confidential, it's just Russia restating their public position at the time, that they would be okay with expansion in general, but Georgia and Ukraine were pain points. They make this pretty ridiculous argument that NATO expansion might divide the country, leading to a civil war, which would force them to intervene? Ironic. Also remember that Russia wanted to join the alliance, so they were fine with NATO in general, they just had strategic concerns about Ukraine and Georgia. You know, I wonder why it's those two countries in particular. I really don't know what they're going on about.
After years of rampaging around the world, blowing up Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, NATO now had their missiles 400 kilometers from the Russian capital.
Alright, let's go through these wars individually. Somalia and Yemen were involved in Operation Ocean Shield, a mission to stop piracy, so not sure why that's super relevant. Afghanistan, yep, fair cop. Now, Libya is somewhat complicated. While there's a lot to criticize about how NATO carried this out, it was an operation that was endorsed by the international community to support a democratic rebellion against a dictator. It's pretty disingenuous to frame this as rampaging around the world, blowing it up, when this is a conversation about Russia, a country that actually does rampage around the world, blowing places up, with the intention of imperial conquest, not poorly thought out military interventions. And you can say something similar about Afghanistan. Like I said, there's no good reason to defend this war, but it was a war waged against an authoritarian regime that was then replaced with a democracy. This is very different to, say, an autocracy launching a unilateral invasion of a democracy because you want their land. And you might say this is a whataboutism, but it's important because he leads into this.
But the plus side for him was that the average Russian was terrified of NATO expansion. Every time NATO blew up a hospital or a school somewhere, Putin's approval rating went through the roof.
This is also a lie. However, it is true that his approval rating spiked both times he invaded Ukraine. Sorry, but if anything, it looks like Russians like it when their own government blows up a hospital somewhere. Oh, and speaking of comparing things to Russia, let's talk about Yugoslavia. So someone made a comment giving roughly the same argument I was going to make about this, and Alexa actually responded. He said that what NATO did to Bosnia, which was part of Yugoslavia, is pretty similar to what Russia did to Ukraine. Both the US and Russia funded and supported a foreign military group, and both made an accusation of genocide. So let's break these down. The LPR and DNR, which will come up later, were puppet governments of the Kremlin that existed to launch a proxy war between Ukraine and Russia in the lead up to the full-scale invasion. And they weren't just supported by Russia, they were directly controlled by them, and they wouldn't exist without them. Then what about that claim of genocide? Well, Russia, with no evidence, fabricated the claim that Ukraine is committing a genocide against Russian speakers in the country's east, to use as a justification for their otherwise unjustifiable invasion. So that doesn't look very good for Russia. So now let's see what the US did. What he's referring to is the claim that the CIA trained KLL fighters during the Kosovo War. Firstly, let's assume this is true. Supporting an actual resistance organization by providing them training manuals, as the claim goes, but not actually providing them weapons, is just a tiny bit different to what Russia did. However, this claim is probably not true. It comes from one article in the Sunday Times that doesn't name its sources. It also refers to claims made by someone interviewed as part of a BBC documentary. However, this conspiracy is never even mentioned in that documentary. There are also other sources that point to this being untrue. So it might have happened, but it's unlikely. Last of all, genocide. The International Court of Justice found Serbia guilty of failing to prevent and prosecute genocide after Republika Srpska, who Serbia funded, committed the Srebrenica genocide against Muslims in Bosnia. And while they probably didn't commit a genocide during the Kosovo War, they did commit an unbelievable number of horrific crimes against humanity, including rape, mass killing of civilians, and arbitrary detention. This was one of the main justifications for NATO's intervention, but after NATO arrived, they ramped up their campaign of evil and ethnically cleansed 90% of the Albanians from Kosovo, something that might have been planned for a while. So to recap, Russia made up a genocide and ran puppet governments for their imperial conquest, while the US might have given some training manuals to a resistance org and intervened because there was an actual genocide and horrific atrocities. Alexa thinks that these things are similar and both are criminal. I love this man so much.
Now, the country was split between Russians in the east and Ukrainians in the west, and all they wanted to do was just punch each other in the head and endlessly swap between either pro-Russian or pro-Western oligarchs. It was an endless cycle. I mean, Yanukovych was a pro-Russian, corrupt asshole who hoarded all the country's mansions, luxury cars, and microphones, I guess. So they had a revolution to kick him out of power and replace him with the pro-Western Yushchenko, who ended up being so corrupt that they kicked him out and went back to Yanukovych, who they kicked out 6 years earlier.
Now, to be fair, Yushchenko wasn't a great president. He had some disputes with Parliament and his PM, and handled it by dissolving Parliament twice and interfered with the judiciary to get a legal ruling on his side. But to be fair, his opposition did as well. All of this led to his popularity tanking, losing his next election. Yanukovych, on the other hand, definitely was a pro-Russian corrupt arsehole. More specifically, this revolution happened because he literally rigged the 2004 presidential election using the powers he had while PM. He also jailed his political opposition and embezzled potentially $37 billion in public funds for him and his associates. Equating these two as equal is Alexa attempting to delegitimize just how frighteningly awful Yanukovych was. So this is where things get real interesting. He starts the section introducing the Euromaidan protests, a series of demonstrations in response to Viktor Yanukovych cancelling a trade agreement with the EU that escalated violently into a full-blown political crisis. He also introduces the second main character of the series,
Neo-Nazis.
Nazis are bad, by the way.
He barely even finished a Sieg Heil with his right hand before John McCain swooped in and shook it. American politicians were now swarming all over Ukraine, ready to fund and support the invigorated far right.
Oh, here we go again. Our best friend, the Americans. I'm sure you've noticed a theme at this point. Something bad happens, then Alexa will try to create a story that blames the US on it. This time, he's going to try to claim that the rise of the far right in Ukraine is caused by American influence, which, as I will demonstrate, is a complete lie. Now, there is another country that could be implicated in this, and you'll never guess who it is. Stay tuned to find out.
Now, the Americans were in charge, and they said, fuck the EU, we're going to back the Nazis. That's literally what they said.
Fuck the EU.
See, now this is a leaked phone call between the US Assistant Secretary of State and the US Ambassador to Ukraine, and they're planning out who they should put in charge of the new Ukrainian government.
In this phone call, they are mainly talking about who they personally think should be in the government, because, you know, they're politicians, it's sort of their job to have opinions. Now yeah, because the US is trying to mediate this political crisis, they are making phone calls that are undoubtedly going to place undue influence on these negotiations, but that is a far cry from saying that they are choosing who is in the new government.
Now this phone call was bad news for poor old Klitschko. You know, first he gets beaten up, then the Americans don't even let him in the government.
So, I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
The real reason Klitschko was not in the new government was because he was offered to join but said no. There's also some tricky language at play. Just before, he was talking about some similar negotiations done by the EU, which would have let Yanukovych stay in power until a snap election was called, while also undoing some of his reforms and freeing the former PM that he imprisoned.
They saw the pro-democracy liberals were losing control to the neo-Nazis, and they pushed for a compromise that would leave Yanukovych in power, but it was too late.
It's very strange that when the EU led negotiations, embedding their own personal views, it's fine, but when the US does it... Now let's be charitable though. Maybe he doesn't have a problem with the US doing this in general, only that they were
gonna back the Nazis. That's literally what they said.
However, that's literally not what they said. The only person they speak strongly in favor of is one guy, Yatsenyuk, not a Nazi. And anyway, the real reason he became prime minister was because he was a pretty obvious choice. He was the factional leader of the Fatherland Party, the largest party in parliament at the time. Oh, and just one other thing while we're on that EU deal. All sides of the conflict signed off on it, except for one, and it wasn't America, you guessed it, it was Russia. Why is it always Russia? Why can't it be someone else for once? Why not Brazil?
And what do you know? Everyone they decided on in that phone call ended up magically being in charge of Ukraine, with neo-Nazis holding numerous government positions.
So let's talk about those
neo-Nazis holding numerous government positions.
All of these people were part of the interim government. The government set up after Yanukovych was dismissed, to rule until the snap presidential and parliamentary elections held later that year. Parubi lasted a bit over 5 months and was out by August 7th. Makhanitsky was there 4 months and was dismissed on the 18th of June. Then Sich left the 12th of November after the election. And yeah, Nazis in government at all is still bad, but you have to remember that Ukraine was really in the shitter. Both the president and the prime minister had fled the country, all while people were still protesting in the street. Somebody desperately needed to bring stability back, and unfortunately, that meant allying with members of the far-right's Svoboda party. However, after the parliamentary elections in November, a grand total of 0 Svoboda party members made it into the new government.
And the new government didn't waste any time. They got rid of Russian as an official language.
This is about the repeal of the 2012 language law that allowed qualifying minority languages, not just Russian, to be used in government text. All the repeal did was go back to the status quo, where they only had one official language, Ukrainian. Pretty mundane stuff.
Started resurrecting all the old Nazi symbols and praising Ukraine's World War II fascist government.
So, Ukraine had definitely done some pretty yikesy stuff both before and after the interim government. But in this case, I have no idea what he's talking about. The closest I can find was the time when Ukraine accused the USSR of distorting the image of World War II revolutionary leader and Nazi collaborator Stefan Bandera. Speaking of though, the second Yatsenyuk government, immediately after the interim one, did pass a law banning Nazi symbols.
Now, if you want to scare the shit out of an ethnic minority, this is how you do it, right? All over Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine, people went wild. It turns out they were scared of Nazis and they wanted out of Ukraine, and they were ready to fight for it.
What he's referring to is the pro-Russian protests in eastern Ukraine that led to the seizure of government buildings and the formation of the separatist breakaway states, the Donetsk People's Republic in Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republic in, you guessed it, Luhansk. Now, let's not pretend like this was some authentic opposition to the Ukrainian government. To his credit, he does point out that they got massive amounts of weapons and funding from Russia.
He pumped them full of Russian weapons and training. They got guns and tanks and guns for their tanks and guns for their guns, plunging Ukraine into an unwinnable civil war.
But it was so much more than that. They were, effectively, puppet states of the Russian government, basically making all of their military and political decisions, while the vast majority of their funding comes directly from the Kremlin. And while we will never know for sure how many legitimate pro-Russian protesters there were originally, we can look at circumstantial evidence. Support for pro-Russian parties fell dramatically during the 2012 and 2014 elections, because, this may shock you, Russians in the East are probably a little more afraid of a country invading their next-door neighbour than some interim government that passed a couple of bad laws. And despite newly developed tensions between Russians and Ukrainians, only 29% of ethnic Russians at least somewhat felt their language is under threat, and only 12% are certain. And now, here's the kicker, Russian activists were paying people to help them storm government buildings. The same person who organised this was also working with Russian TV channels to produce pro-Russian propaganda. A similar thing happened in Odessa, and there is also evidence of Russian military officers directly participating in the raids. But despite this, it is still not certain that there weren't any protesters who participated in good faith and genuinely supported the cause. After all, there is still a lot of support for Russia in this region, and a lot of people before the crisis did actually want to secede. Saying that, framing this as Russians were scared of the new government so they started protesting, is at the very least extremely dishonest, and frankly, playing into Russian propaganda.
The new government was desperate to subdue the Russian-backed separatists, and no one is willing to kill and die more than fundamentalist, radical neo-Nazis. Now, it's obviously a bit weird to focus on neo-Nazis in Ukraine, because every country has neo-Nazis, right? We've got neo-Nazis here in Australia. But Ukraine is the only country in the world that openly has full-blown neo-Nazi formations in its military. Like Azov Battalion, for example, whose leader, Andriy Beletsky, is known for saying all this cute stuff like, "It's Ukraine's mission to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led inferior races."
So the Ukrainian military was in shambles as a war was going on in the east, fueled by Russia. In response, the Ukrainian government turned to the ultranationalists to help beat back the enemy. Then the Minister of Interior made the Azov Battalion officially part of the National Guard. And my question here is, what else was the Ukrainian government was supposed to do? The country was falling apart, the separatists were spreading westward, their military was in shambles, and among the few forces you did have, you didn't know who's going to betray you for Russia. Then comes a group of highly motivated ultranationalists with weapons training, whose entire worldview is predicated on fighting Russian invaders and whose allegiance is unquestionably with Ukraine. And they tell you, give us weapons and support and we'll get shit done. What decision maker would say no to that? Even if you hate the far-righters, wouldn't sending them to war mean many of them would die? That would be a win-win, right? You help halt the Russian offensives and you end up with less ultranationalists in the end.
Could not have put it better myself. Also want to point out that he words this part to make it seem like there are multiple neo-Nazi formations.
But Ukraine is the only country in the world that openly has full-blown neo-Nazi formations in its military. Like Azov Battalion, for example.
To be clear, Azov is the only one.
Now, these guys were sent east to go fight the separatists, and the US loved it. They were training them, sending them crazy amounts of money and weapons.
When he says the US is sending them crazy amounts of weapons, he sort of implies that the US is sending neo-Nazis these weapons directly, describing this similarly to how he painted Russian funding of separatists.
He pumped them full of Russian weapons and training. They got guns and tanks and guns for their tanks and guns for their guns.
Let's actually have a look at these crazy amounts of money and weapons. Between 2014 and 2017, Ukraine did not receive any lethal military support. However, the only heavy weaponry they received were Javelin anti-tank missiles that are required to be stored in western Ukraine, hundreds of miles from the front lines. And most importantly, none of this is directly given to the Azov Battalion. It is given to the Ukraine Armed Forces, and because Azov are a small division of that, well yeah, obviously they're going to get some of that support. Looking at his sources, he's got a lot more on this, but once again, applying a generous amount of padding. He managed to find one claim that is actually true, the fact that anti-Semitism in the far right is a real issue in Ukraine, and he's got a whopping 9 sources more or less talking about the same thing. But in terms of Azov receiving a crazy amount of weapons, there is one Medium blog post, not actual news article, talking about how Ukraine may have received a type of grenade launcher from the US as part of a contract at the end of 2016. However, this is just talking about them being bought from a private company that happens to be based in the US. He also cites an op-ed talking about the CIA training insurgents in Ukraine. They get their info from another article that revealed the existence of a CIA program that trained Ukrainian paramilitaries. To be fair, this is a pretty crazy story, but there is absolutely no mention of Azov Battalion or any other neo-Nazi organization.
And just like when the US trained and funded far-right extremists to fight the Russians in the 80s and turned Afghanistan into a mecca for global jihadis, the Ukraine war became the hip place to be for the global far-right looking for military experience to use to terrorize people back home.
I want to talk more generally about this Nazi stuff. What he's saying is more or less true. Ukraine does have a fairly serious Nazi problem, regardless of whether it's just as bad or worse than other places in Eastern Europe. However, as he correctly pointed out, like how American intervention in Afghanistan led to a rise of extremism, a certain other country might have led to a similar rise of extremism in Ukraine, when Russia backs politicians that plunge your country into chaos, forcing the government to work with Nazis, then invades your territory and starts a puppet regime on your land, forcing your military to take on neo-Nazi formations. It's no wonder that your country has a fascism problem. And when it's, as we've mentioned, the US and Afghanistan, or the rise of ISIS after the Iraq War, or Palestinians voting for a group called Hamas after decades of Israeli occupation, he will happily point the finger at America and its allies. But when it's someone else, not only will he not place the correct blame, but he will try and weasel his way into justifying why actually it's America's fault, the country, in this case, giving aid and helping a developing country being attacked. Because the only analysis he understands is America equals bad.
But that's more or less irrelevant. The real victims here are the people of Ukraine. They're caught in a bloodthirsty tug of war between the US and Russia, with tens of thousands of people dying and terrorized into fleeing their homes.
So of course, to conform to his narrative, and to not look evil, he has to both sides the suffering of innocent Ukrainians by pretending that they are stuck between the evil Russians and the equally evil Americans who are both trying to fuck with their country. But the Ukrainian people would like to disagree. The war tanked Ukraine's opinion of Russia, while increasing their opinions of Western institutions like NATO and the EU. And remember, these polls were before the full-scale invasion in February 22.
A comedian called Volodymyr Zelenskyy stars in a sitcom about a high school teacher fed up with corruption who unexpectedly becomes president of Ukraine. And then the comedian playing the president of Ukraine unexpectedly becomes president of Ukraine. The peace candidate promising to end the war. The Nazis were pissed. Once upon a time they were untouchable, right? And now when the far-right battalions refused to do a ceasefire, suddenly there was this Jewish dude, the president, on the front lines getting up in their grill. Now, if there's one thing Nazis hate, it's Jews taking away their weapons. But unfortunately, as hard as Zelenskyy tried, they just break the ceasefires anyway. He was never in full control of his own country. The Americans and the Russians were, and they didn't give a shit. They were just using Ukraine to fight each other.
So it's pretty dishonest to say that Ukrainian fighters broke the ceasefire he negotiated. Yeah, there was a lot of individual ceasefire violations. However, this was by far the most successful ceasefire in the entire history of the war, halving the number of violations from the previous year, and resulted in the lowest level of violence since the beginning of the conflict. Plus, controlling ceasefire violations is somewhat hard to do from the top down, since it only takes one dickhead to shoot before the other side retaliates and you've started up a local conflict. So, since both Ukraine and Russia accused each other of ceasefire violations, by this logic, if Zelenskyy isn't in control of his own country, then surely Russia, whose puppet government also violated the ceasefire, is also not in control? And as for America, well, I'm pretty sure at this point have made it very clear that the US have basically nothing to do with this.
I mean, they were also using Ukraine to make lots and lots of money for their buddies. I mean, like Hunter Biden, right? He's Biden's son, and he's also America's best-looking crack addict. With absolutely zero experience, he was given $1 million a year to sit on the board of a Ukrainian gas company.
Well, this just isn't true. Hunter Biden had an established career as an attorney, had founded an advisory firm, and sat on the board of another company without pay. Now, let me be very clear, I am not defending Hunter or any of his business dealings. This is one cooked motherfucker, and has worked with some pretty sketchy people. I'm just pointing out that he isn't presenting this situation honestly. I am, however, much more willing to defend his father's relationship with him, which we will get to now.
And when Ukraine's top prosecutor started investigating the company for corruption, Biden withheld US aid until they fired the prosecutor.
Look, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Oh, sorry, I accidentally clicked on a Tim Pool video. Oh wait, no, this is Alexa Volovich, supposed progressive leftist parroting a right-wing conspiracy that was peddled as part of a smear campaign to support Trump's re-election campaign. The Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin, was fired because of pressure by the US to withhold aid, but it wasn't because he investigated corruption, it was because he failed to investigate it. This was an initiative that was supported by the US and EU, that was recommended to the president by one of his advisors. And, most importantly, Shokin wasn't even investigating Burisma when this happened. The investigation occurred in 2014, 2 years before he was fired in 2016. Not only that, but his investigation focused on the years 2010 to 2012, 2 to 4 years before Hunter Biden joined in 2014. And if you're still not convinced, Yuri Lutsenko, Shokin's successor, said that he did not violate any Ukrainian laws. This was even someone that Trump was working with to find dirt on Joe Biden. More on that later. The Prosecutor General after him also did an audit of old case files, finding no evidence of wrongdoing. Then, to top it all off, even the Republican House Committee couldn't find anything against Joe Biden on this matter.
Trump did exactly the same thing,
Oh, look at that. He almost came close to talking about something that actually happened. Now, you might not know what he's talking about here, but if you were alive at the end of 2019, you do.
Now, Donald Trump has become only the third US president to be impeached.
President Trump has just been impeached on both Article 1, abuse of power, and on Article 2, obstruction of Congress.
Has abused his office for personal gain.
Article 1 is adopted.
However folks may feel about impeachment, the gravity of this moment is undeniable.
As part of a released transcript between Trump and Zelenskyy in July of 2019, Trump was performing a quid pro quo to exchange military aid to Ukraine for help to find dirt on Joe Biden and his son's business dealings with the country. And, according to a whistleblower, Trump's lawyers told staff to remove the transcript from the computer system that they were normally stored in. Unlike the propaganda conspiracy about Biden withholding aid, this is something that is not only true, but an egregious and potentially illegal abuse of power that actually happened. It's really strange that someone who supposedly isn't right-wing would parrot a lie about Joe Biden while glossing over something that Donald Trump actually did.
Anyway, Zelenskyy's approval rating was plummeting. Suddenly, Zelenskyy did a complete backflip. He went full Putin. He arrested the head of the opposition who had just overtaken him in the polls. He shut down opposition TV channels and most importantly, began talks for NATO membership.
So I just want to point out that one of the articles he flashes but doesn't cite is from World Socialist website, an online newspaper of the International Trotskyist movement. Definitely a very legitimate and unbiased source you got there, Alexa. Alright, so Viktor Medvedchuk, the opposition leader who headed the pro-Russian Opposition Platform for Life party, was arrested for suspected treason against Ukraine. While the court case was closed to the public, the prosecution did share some of their evidence, including hacked emails, leaked messages, and intercepted phone calls that showed that he, among other things, controlled an oil and gas company that he kept off the record that was under his control. He spoke personally with Putin, asking him to move a military training zone so it wouldn't get in the way of his business. And to be fair, it is suspicious that he was arrested after his party overtook Zelensky's in the poll, so it's not out of the question that this was politically motivated. However, it's not like this is some sort of fast trial done by an autocrat, like Putin, as Alexa is claiming. It's a similar story with those opposition TV channels, which were shut down as part of sanctions against the channel's owner, Taras Kozak. Because they weren't just opposition channels, they were literally Russian propaganda channels being broadcast in Ukraine during a war that Russia is waging.
Now, Putin was absolutely furious. Russia starts building up troops on the border and sends out a draft treaty. It said that Ukraine needs to have guaranteed neutrality and that NATO removes its missiles and battle groups from Eastern Europe and Zelenskyy never plays piano ever again. Now, this standoff lasted for about a year and the US spent that year doing what you'd imagine someone would do if they wanted Russia to invade Ukraine. First off, they refused to negotiate.
There are some very obvious non-starters in things that the Russians have put on the table.
Well, as Antony Blinken said, there were some non-starters. The US never said they wouldn't negotiate at all. Here's what Blinken said literally immediately after.
There may be other issues that are appropriate for discussion and conversation, just as there are things that we would put on the table that Russia needs to respond to.
What was a non-starter was Russia's demand that Ukraine and Georgia be barred from entering NATO, even if it's what they desire.
Look, the president's been extremely clear for many, many years about some basic principles that no one is moving back on. The principle that one country does not have the right to change by force the borders of another. That one country does not have the right to dictate the policies of another, or to tell that country with whom it may associate.
And why might Russia want this? Well, if you've been paying attention, we've covered this already. Because a NATO membership is the only thing preventing Russia from invading whatever neighbor it sees fit. And there's a lot more to these draft treaties than just that. Russia wanted NATO to not deploy forces to countries that joined recently. NATO did actually commit to not permanently stationing troops in new member states after 1997, until Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. So, if Putin didn't want NATO in Eastern Europe, maybe he shouldn't have given them a reason to be there. But as I mentioned, there are things the US would be willing to negotiate on, like a ban on deployment of missiles. However, Russia's treaty would ban US missiles from Europe while still allowing Russia to deploy their own. It's also important to talk about the Budapest Memorandum, which made Ukraine give up their nuclear arsenal to Russia in exchange for them respecting Ukraine's sovereignty. They, of course, violated this agreement in 2014. Honestly, I am surprised the US is willing to work with them at all, considering the fact that Russia has proven time and time again that they have no regard for the sovereignty of their neighbors, and will violate any treaty they sign whenever they see fit. But this begs the question, why would Russia put forward a treaty that the US was obviously going to reject? One theory is that the treaty's rejection could be used as another casus belli for the invasion. But luckily, that sort of propaganda talking point would only be fed to the Russian people, and would never spread to a country like Australia.
But simultaneously, the US kept reminding Russia that if they did invade, the US wouldn't do anything about it.
While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine.
Wait, hold on. Did that sentence just start with while? Let's have a look at the full clip.
While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine, we have supplied the Ukrainian military with equipment to help them defend themselves. We provided training and advice and intelligence for the same purpose.
Obviously, the US isn't going to engage in a direct war with Russia, because, you know. I'm really not sure why Alexa thought he could get away with this lie. Does he think that no one watching was alive at the end of 2021? The US pledged to deploy troops to Eastern Europe if Russia invaded, and just before the full-scale invasion, the United States imposed sanctions on Russia.
To be clear, if Russia decides to invade, that would also have consequences here at home. I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices.
A furious Zelenskyy comes out and reveals that the West was never even going to let him into NATO anyway, but they made him pretend that he was going to.
That's also not entirely true. Ukraine had not joined NATO because they weren't ready yet. Even before the full-scale invasion, Russia's occupation of Crimea would have made it difficult, and they were a long way from meeting the institutional and military standards required for membership. But even if they can't join right now, it would happen eventually. Zelenskyy is being hyperbolic in this interview, but it comes from a genuine frustration over the lack of clarity as to when or how Ukraine will join NATO. Because yeah, if Ukraine was let into NATO before 2014, we wouldn't be in this mess. However, you can't simultaneously side with Zelenskyy on this while also making it a core point of your argument that NATO expansion is evil and will provoke Russia. And to finish off this train wreck of a video, he replays the same clip of Biden, with the same crucial context cut out. And because he hates America so much, that's what he'll do to use them as a scapegoat for the suffering of millions of people. Well, thank you for making it this far. It took me an unreasonable amount of time to make. I might make more videos about BoyBoy. I already have one in the works that is tangentially related to one of his videos, so look out for that. I'm also looking forward to see if most of the dislikes are from salty BoyBoy fans or enraged members of the Darman Vineboom community. Okay, cheers. Bye.